Been a lot of headlines this week about the NAR settlement and how it's going to kill commissions, and there's no more 6% commission, no more 3% commission, no more buyer's commission. You think that's true? Stay tuned. Okay, there has been a lot of press about last week's NAR settlement over the commission lawsuits. Most of it's inaccurate. In fact, a lot of the hysteria and inaccurate info is coming from the agent community, but the media is really throwing some whoppers out there as well. We're going to get to all of that in a minute. I'll give you a short history lesson on where buyer's agency came from, when it happened, why it happened, what they said would happen, and what actually happened. Got all that? Good. Be sure to stay to the end when I make my predictions where all this lands. It'll be worth the wait. So before we get started, let me cover a couple of things. Number one, I'm not an attorney. Shocker. Number two, for the agents watching, I am not your managing broker. Number three, I am simply someone trying to get accurate info out there amongst all the misleading and inaccurate information that's getting out there, put out there by multiple sources and being claimed as true. For the TLDR crowd and the high Ds, stick with me. It's actually worth it to get to the end of this one. All right, so let's get to the meat of this one. Where did it start? Prior to the 1980s, there was no such thing as buyer representation. Everyone worked for the seller, either as an agent who was a listing agent or a sub-agent who was the agent who brought the buyer. The buyer had no representation whatsoever, even though almost all of them thought they did. New York and California were the vanguard for the buyer's agency movement, and it slowly spread from there. It's probably early to mid-90s before it was widely accepted, and when it was introduced, there was much gnashing of teeth and rending in flesh in the realtor community because it was change. And we all know how human behavior loves change.
Totally.
I want to quote a paragraph from a story in the New York Times. It's from a story entitled, "When the Broker Works for the Buyer," and it was dated in September 19th, 1993. And I quote, "Traditionally, the commission on the sale of a house is about 6%. If two brokers are involved, the fee is usually split. But a buyer's broker is willing to work for less," said James S. Arrow, an exclusive buyer's broker in Rochester, New York, and a spokesman for the Single Agency Realty Association, an advocacy group in Rockville, Maryland. "I'm trying to bring it back to the idea of fees for services, not a straight 6% commission standard rate. For example, the sale of a $100,000 home would give a traditional broker a $6,000 commission. And if there were two brokers on the deal, they would each get $3,000. But if the buyer's broker agrees to forego a commission and work for, say, a $1,000 fee, the $2,000 difference could come out of the price of the home, dropping the cost to $98,000. The irony here is that they were saying the same thing in the early 1990s that they're saying today about this will drive down commission and it will drive down prices. Well, we all know how that worked out. Before living in Idaho, Kirsten and I sold real estate in the Los Angeles and Ventura County markets for a long time. And since it was such a large and competitive market, all the serious players in real estate had shops there, and we were competing with all of them, especially the discounters. We competed against all the traditional brokerages, Century 21, Keller, Prudential, all of that stuff. And then also the newcomers, or at least in that market, like Compass, the agency, England Volkers, and a bunch of independents as well. On top of all that, we had the discounters, Redfin, Purple Bricks, Rex, Help Yourself. If having the absolute lowest cost of selling your home really mattered and was the prime driver of who you hired to list your home, then those discount firms would have absolutely dominated the market. But in fact, Rex didn't even offer buyer agency commission at all. They didn't pay any buyer's agent. Rex doesn't exist anymore. Purple Bricks doesn't exist in the U.S. anymore either, but they are quoted quite a bit over the last week in articles stating that we are seeing the end of 6% commission. They just omit the fact that Purple Bricks lost so much money being a discounter here, they had to exit the U.S. market and may have to do the same in the U.K. because they're not making any money over there either. Same thing happened with Rex. They're gone, but their CEO is quoted all over the place in print this week and last. The Los Angeles market is one of the top 3 most competitive markets in the country. There are over 60,000 agents and tens of billions of dollars a year in residential real estate, like 70 or 80 billion are sold every year. If discounting was the key to success, it would dominate there. In spite of all that competition, Kirsten and I ranked in the top 2% of all realtors nationally in sales. Not the top 2% in Los Angeles or LA County or in California, all of America, and we didn't discount. I'm not going to turn this into an advertisement for us, and you can call me to ask, see how we did that. But if discounting was the key, it would own Los Angeles. Okay, that covers a brief history lesson. Let's get into what is and is not covered in the settlement, as well as what this means for all of us. First off, let's cover the myths that are garnering all of the headlines right now. All right, number one, the settlement forces brokers to reduce their compensation. False. Number two, the settlement will, for the first time, allow sellers to no longer pay compensation to a buyer's agent. False. Number three, The settlement prohibits sellers from paying a commission to a buyer's agent and relieves the seller of that financial burden. False. Number 4, the settlement will serve to meaningfully lower home prices. False again. The settlement is a win for buyers who will now be able to negotiate the fee for their representation. That's questionable at best, and you get what you pay for in that scenario, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Number 6, the settlement will result in significant restitution to consumers who were harmed over the recent years in the transaction by realtors. Also false. First off, the settlement does not change anything about commissions at all. Not the amount, not who pays. Those things have always been negotiable between the parties, and most states have listing contracts that clearly state that. The main factual points of the settlement, if the settlement is approved by the court with no changes, are as follows. Number 1, there can no longer be a guaranteed buyer-agent commission offered anywhere in the MLS field. They are eliminating and prohibiting the requirement by the National Association of Realtors and their owned MLSs or member boards where the listing brokers or sellers must make offers of compensation to the buyer's brokers or other buyer's reps. No more forcing that. They also prohibit that such offers, if made, be blanket or unconditional or unilateral. Number 2, they prohibit brokers and sellers from making any offer of compensation or disclosing in the MLS anywhere that there may be compensation or revealing total broker compensation for both sides. Next, they agree not to create, facilitate, or support any non-MLS mechanism, including by providing listing information to an internet aggregator's website for such purpose, for listing brokers or sellers to make offers of compensation to buyer brokers and to other buyer representatives, either directly or through buyers. All right, that's a mouthful. However, this provision is not violated by a realtor MLS providing data or data feeds to a realtor MLS participant, or a third party unless that MLS knows those data or data feeds are being used directly or indirectly to establish or maintain a platform for offers of compensation from multiple brokers, meaning that the MLS cannot intentionally circumvent this requirement. So what they're saying here specifically, without all the legalese, is that you cannot require a listing broker or a seller to offer compensation through the MLS. Now it's actually prohibited. You cannot have any field in the MLS where you talk about buyer's agent compensation. So they're saying, okay, buyer's agent compensation through the MLS is gone, because the actual rule as it stood with the MLS was that if you were a listing agent and you listed the home, you had to have a clear cooperation policy, meaning you had to put something in there. Now, there was never anything that stated the amount or the percentage or anything like that. That's always been prohibited by law. And matter of fact, the listing contracts have always said, commissions are always negotiable, not set by law, blah, blah, blah. But basically, there's never been a standard. As much as the papers say, oh, it's fixed, it's got to be this, it's got to be that. That's never been the case ever. Are there certain percentages and certain amounts people won't work for? Yeah. We've walked listings many times where they weren't, they just said, no, I'm going to offer you this low amount. And we're like, great, find somebody else. For what we do, we're not going to do it for that amount. Nothing wrong with that. It's a free market. What they're doing now is they're saying that the MLS cannot require you, or the National Association of Realtors or the MLS cannot require you to put a buyer's agent commission into the MLS. And I think that's where the misunderstanding is, where they're saying, oh, it's the end of buyer's commission. They can't pay buyer's commission more. Nothing could be further from the truth. You just cannot put it in the MLS. It can't be a searchable field, and you cannot mention it in the MLS itself. So also not a violation if a realtor or a realtor MLS participant is displaying both the data from the data feeds, the MLS data, and offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives on their own listings. All right, so that's another one too. So I guess in a nutshell, if let's say I own my own brokerage, if I want to have all of my listings, I have my IDX feed coming, which is, it's what feeds Zillow and everything else. I have my feed of all the homes that are there, but on the homes that are actually listed with my brokerage that I own, I can, on that separate feed, put on there what I'm offering for compensation for the ones in my own listing. That's fine. Can't do it chain-wide, throughout the entire MLS. That's prohibited. But if I want to have my own website where I have my own listings for our firm, all the brokerage listings listed there with how much they're offering on each one, that's totally legal, which again is why we're saying commissions aren't going away. They're not outlawing them. All they're doing is talking about how we communicate that. Third major change, and it's not really major, but it's requiring realtors and realtor MLS participants acting for sellers to conspicuously disclose to sellers and obtain seller approval for any payment or offer of payment that listing broker or seller will make to another broker, agent, or other buyer's representative, like, say a real estate attorney, if that happens in your state, that is acting for the buyers. And such disclosure must be in writing, provided in advance of any payment or agreement to pay another broker acting for buyers, and specify the amount of or rate of any such payment. Kirsten and I are licensed brokers in a couple different, California and Idaho. Listing agreements there have always had that. They've always clearly stated how much the listing agent is going to get, total commission, how much of that commission is going to be shared with the buyer's agent. And we've always stayed true to that. Maybe in some states they don't talk about it like that, and this is just taking that and making it the same everywhere. But in the states we've operated in the states we've bought and sold real estate in other states as well, and it was the same thing. It clearly stated how much total commission we were paying, how much was being shared with the buyer's agent. So, I mean, this is like a difference without distinction, I guess. I mean, I'm not aware of any state that operates without having this in writing, but it's part of the settlement. And the giant loophole, which is paragraph 58, section 8. And it says that the practice changes in paragraph 58 of this settlement agreement shall not prevent offers of compensation to buyers, brokers, or other buyer representatives off of the MLS, or it will not prohibit sellers from offering buyer concessions on a Realtor MLS, for buyers' closing costs, so long as that concession is not limited to or conditioned upon the retention of a buyer's broker or buyer's representative. So, what does that mean? It means literally that saying the entire settlement does not prohibit a seller from paying a buyer's commission. It does not prohibit a listing agent from telling the buyer's agents in any other form outside of the MLS that they are paying a cooperating commission. So, all these headlines that went out there saying it's the death of the 6% commission, or whatever it might be in your market, whatever, they didn't read the settlement at all. In this one paragraph, you could drive a truck through the loophole so big. Will it survive and be approved? I don't know. We'll see. But literally, the exact verbiage does not prohibit the listing agent or the seller from communicating about compensation outside of the MLS, and it certainly does not stop the agent or the seller, listing agent or the seller, from entering a concession into the MLS. So it's probably going to happen, if it gets approved, one or two things are going to happen. There's either going to be, in the agent comments, it'll say 3% buyer's concession or whatever the percentage might be, or there will be a new MLS field for concessions, that preloaded concessions that takes the place of buyer's commission. Some of you will be really pissed to hear that, but that's how it's going to work. I mean, it is what it is. I'm not trying to be the smartest guy in the room or anything else, but those of us who are career real estate brokers or realtors, I mean, think about it. We've gone through the Great Recession, had to learn to do short sales, had to deal with all the REOs and all the other stuff. We adapt and overcome. It's what we do. It's just like everybody else who owns a small business and entrepreneur. They're going to roll challenges at you. You got to figure out how to overcome and keep going. It's what we do. The next important part, buyer rep agreements. Here are the specific changes, which Idaho already follows anyway, to see what's going on. In paragraph 58, section 6, unless inconsistent with state or federal law or regulation before and during the operation of paragraph 58 of this settlement agreement, it requires that all Realtor MLS participants working with a buyer enter into a written agreement before the buyer tours any homes with the following. Number 1, to the extent that such Realtor or participant will receive compensation from any source, the agreement must specify and conspicuously disclose the amount or rate of compensation it will receive and how this amount will be determined. B, the amount of compensation reflected must be objectively ascertainable and may not be open-ended. For example, buyer-broker compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering to the buyer. Can't say that. You actually have to have an exact percentage or an exact dollar amount. Point C, such a realtor or participant may not receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement with the buyer. This is important. Now what they're trying to say is that before you show any houses, and this is nationally now, Idaho already kind of follows this anyway, but nationally, any buyer who wants to go look at houses is going to have to enter into a buyer-broker agreement with the agent that clearly states how much that agent's going to get paid ahead of time before They know what the market is doing before they know what houses they're going to see. This is going to create far more issues on the buy side than it does on the sell side. Not insurmountable, and again, people will figure out how to work around it, but basically the buyer and the buyer's agent are going to sit down at a table and they're going to talk about, okay, in this market, Mr. Buyer or Miss Buyer, average commission is X, so we're going to put X in here, and if we get over X, then you go ahead and you get extra money and you use that towards that. But if it's less than X, then you need to make up the shortfall. Now, where this becomes an issue, and I've talked about this in other videos, is that let's talk about VA buyers specifically, and Idaho has a huge military community. With a VA buyer, VA buyers are specifically prohibited from compensating their agent. The compensation has to come from the sell side. So let's say you're a VA buyer, you have an agreement where you're going to pay your buyer's agent X. You go find a house you love, and that seller is offering nothing, refuses to offer anything, not playing ball with anybody, goes, nope, this is what I'm doing. So at that point, your agent has to try to negotiate a concession for you that then becomes payment for the realtor. Or who knows, but you literally cannot, on your HUD-1, your closing statement, you can't have it that you paid the buyer's agent, because the VA prohibits that. So something to think about that I don't know that everybody really thought about before they wrote up the settlement, but there you have it. So again, buyers will have to meet with their agents, have a signed buyer representation agreement in place that clearly states up front how much the buyer broker is going to get paid. So, everybody needs to operate with some grace on this, both buyers agents. I mean, as a buyer's agent, you need to be able to communicate your value. And this is important. I mean, we just did a deal not too long ago where we were representing the buyer. On home inspections, it turns out that some work had been done where the electrical was substandard and the plumbing had some issues as well. So we negotiated a credit to cover all that to bring it back up to code, so everything's fine. So when they went to go sell the house, it wasn't going to be an issue. Then the appraisal came in low, and not a little bit. We were able to negotiate and go to the listing agent and show how if we were to walk away or this deal were to die, they would probably take the same, if not less, from somebody else. So we kept the deal together on that point. And then at the end, the lender threw us a curveball, and we had to extend the escrow, a little bit more in a week. But we were able to keep it all together on all this. So that's value that an experienced buyer agent brings, and that's why a buyer needs good representation. However, not all agents are created equal. Just like any other sector, you've got great agents, you've got bad agents. You go in any sector you want, you've got good and bad in that too. So if buyers, talk to your agents, make sure that they're bringing value to the table, and agents, be sure that you know how to communicate your value to the buyer so they understand what they're getting for the money that they're agreeing to up front. But realize also that most sellers are not going to quit paying buyer's agent commission because they want buyer's agents to show up with their buyers. The next point prohibits realtors and realtor MLS participants from representing to a client or a customer that their brokerage services are free or available at no cost to the client unless they are actually receiving no payment whatsoever from any source for those services. So that's kind of self-explanatory. The buyer is paying for the services whether the seller pays or not, but you can't say it's free. All right, because we're getting into legalese again, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version on the next two sections because they're not as impactful as the ones we just talked about. Number one, realtors and participants must disclose and get approval in writing for any compensation to buyer's agents, and they must disclose how much the other agent will be offered. This is already standard practice in Idaho and California and everywhere else we've ever done business, so I don't know why that's in there, but perhaps there's some states that don't have that. Number two, listing or compensation forms must clearly state that commissions are not set by law. This is also an existing practice everywhere, and that they're negotiable. Number three, it requires that realtors or participants not filter out searches based on commissions offered. So this one is worth talking about. Kirsten and I love this point, all right? Commissions as a searchable field. It's a pet peeve. Kirsten and I fought tooth and nail against this at the board we were at when this came out. This was like 2010 or 11, if I remember correctly. And we thought it was a really bad idea. You should not filter what your buyer sees by commission. And this was back before Zillow and everybody got big. So it was a much bigger thing then than now, simply because no buyer that we deal with anymore simply looks at our feed that we send them. They're looking at Zillow, they're looking at Redfin, they're looking at Realtor.com or whatever else their favorite portal is. So even if you were trying to filter it out, it does, they're still going to see other stuff and they're going to say, well, why aren't you showing me this house? So, it's a bad business practice if you do that. However, it's great that you can't, search MLS commission anymore. But if you can't put the if you can't put the commission in the MLS, how can you search for it anyway? Again, kind of virtue signaling and doing it like that, but it's there, so there you have it. And again, Kirsten and I love the fact they put that in there, but since MLS is going away, commission is going away as a searchable field, doesn't matter. Now, where does this leave us if the settlement gets approved? And honestly, it may not, but where does it leave us if it does? Here's a quick analogy. Think back to the last time you entered a destination in either Apple or Google Maps. It'll usually give you 2 or 3 different routes to get to the same place, right? This agreement isn't that different. You're still going to get to the same place, but now you got to go a couple different ways. Number 1, the buyer's agent commission can no longer be advertised in the MLS, but you can advertise it or communicate it anywhere you want to outside the MLS. Different route. Number 2, buyer's agents will need to have a buyer-broker rep agreement in place before showing homes, and it needs to clearly state what the buyer's agent is going to be paid, whether it's a percentage of the purchase price or a dollar amount, and the buyer's agent cannot be paid more than the agreement states. So who do you think is going to put the low number in there? Not many. They'll say the high number for the most part and work it out if it comes in lower than that. All right, so number 3, buyer's agents cannot filter searches they set up for clients with commissions as one of the search criteria. Since commission's going away by itself and you can't put it in the MLS, I think that kind of takes care of it. Ultimately, this was about the class action attorneys getting their 30% of a few $1 billion, honestly. They were very strategic in the angles they took, where they filed the cases, the judges they picked, and, the states that they did it in. It was set up in such a way that settling was always the only viable options. None of the defendants have the assets to post a bond in the $100 million range or $1 billion range in order to appeal their cases. The attorneys knew this, and ultimately that was their goal. If you bought or sold a home in the covered period, you might see somewhere between $7 and $12 back. Seriously, I'm not joking. Between the total settlement and the millions and millions of homeowners are in it, there's not a lot left over. But the attorneys making a minimum of 30%, might even be more than that. Let's say it turns out to be $3 billion in the settlement. Could be more, could be less, I don't know, but say $3 billion. And they get 30%, that's almost $1 billion. It's high $900 million, where those of us who bought and sold real estate in that period that are quote unquote covered under the settlement, you might see between $7 and $12. Something needs to be reformed, maybe tort. I don't know, call me crazy. That's a separate rant, separate video. Now, for the TLDRs and high Ds that made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you. You can go on now. For those who want to dig into some other details and see who got thrown under the bus in this settlement, stick with me a few minutes, just a couple minutes, I'm almost done, promise. Overall, I'm happy with it because both of our brokerages that we've been associated with, the major brokerages, they've already settled. And then anything else we have done as an independent brokerage is covered as well. So I'm happy with all that. If I were in a brokerage that did more than $2 billion in sales in 2022, I would be very unhappy because they are not covered in this settlement and they got thrown under the bus by NAR. You have some of the biggest names in the business in that group. Of the top 500 brokerages for 2022, 173 of them did more than $2 billion in sales. We're talking about Home Services, which is Berkshire Hathaway, you got Compass, Douglas Elliman, Real, EXP. In the settlement rate of the NAR settlement is 0.0025 of their average annual revenue, and that's a lot more than the companies who have already settled actually paid. For example, Compass, they'd be on the hook for about $507 million, while Anywhere, Keller Williams, and Remax combined only paid $208 million. So Compass would be far better off negotiating a separate settlement than getting involved with the NAR one. We'll see. Also, the Department of Justice is not party to the suit or the settlement, and they have made it known that they want to prohibit a seller from ever paying a buyer's agent commission, but I don't know how they can actually enforce that with it coming across some serious constitutional issues. Stay tuned. That said, never underestimate the government's ability to get involved and make things worse than they actually are right now. Remember, the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 is why you're paying close to $1,000, if not more, for an appraisal right now, as well as why credit card interest rates are up over 30%, late fees, overdraft fees, and all those other fees are so high because the act lifted the limits that had been in place prior to 2010. So we'll see how this all plays out. If anything comes to fruition, it'll probably go into place around July, So look forward to some chaos near the end of peak selling season. Thank you for that. As always, please feel free to reach out. Comments, questions, send me an email, call me, send a DM. This is far from over, and honestly, there are all kinds of twists and turns to be seen before we get any kind of real clarity. I imagine I'll be making a number of videos on this topic, so if there's a certain portion of it you wanted to learn about or you'd like me to talk about, send it, like I said, send me an email, make a comment, send a DM, and I'll be happy to address it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we'd certainly love for you to do that. And as always, thank you for taking the time to watch us. I sincerely appreciate it, as do all of us on the Powell Group team. Thank you.